They ignored the alarm for 3 minutes and ended up causing the worst industrial explosion ever recorded. But how could something so catastrophic happen? How could a simple oversight lead to such devastation? This is the story of one of the most tragic industrial disasters in history, where a moment of inaction cost countless lives and left an indelible mark on industrial safety forever. On the morning of the explosion, everything seemed routine. The factory was humming with the usual noise of machines working at full capacity, the workers moving about with their tasks, and the usual safety checks were in place. But no one could predict the disaster that was about to unfold. A warning alarm blared through the facility, a loud, unmistakable sound designed to alert workers to a serious threat. But for 3 agonizing minutes, nothing changed. The alarm continued to ring, echoing through the corridors, yet nothing was done. What followed would become a tragic reminder of the importance of never ignoring safety protocols. Why did they ignore the alarm? What were they thinking? Was it a simple mistake, or was something more sinister at play? These are the questions we will explore in this video as we dig into the details of the explosion that caused unimaginable destruction. But before we dive into the heart of the disaster, let's first understand the environment in which this tragic event took place. The factory, located in a bustling industrial district, was known for its heavy machinery and complex processes. The plant produced chemicals used in manufacturing, and the workers were familiar with the risks involved. Industrial accidents were, unfortunately, not unheard of, but this particular explosion would be like none before. The warning signs were clear, and yet they were ignored. The people in charge chose to delay action for reasons we'll examine, and that delay would cost them dearly. As we begin to peel back the layers of this incident, remember one thing: the explosion didn't just happen in a split second. It was the result of a chain of events, small missteps that built up over time. This was a disaster waiting to happen, and it could have been prevented. If you're enjoying the video so far, don't forget to leave a comment sharing your thoughts on what you think caused this industrial disaster. Also, if you want to keep learning about these tragic events, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more. Now, let's dive deeper into the next part of this story. Before the explosion, there were signs, smaller incidents, that should have been enough to trigger caution. However, those in charge of the factory, perhaps distracted by the daily grind or confident in their experience, failed to act in time. What exactly went wrong? Let's start by examining the events that unfolded just before the disaster. It began with an unusual sound, a faint mechanical hum that wasn't quite right. A vibration, felt by some workers, seemed to signal that something was off with the equipment. Machines were often temperamental, but this time, the sound was different. Some employees raised concerns, but the warnings were brushed off. "It's just the pressure valves acting up," one supervisor said, as if these things were common in the factory. But these small, subtle clues should have been enough for someone to take the alarm seriously. Then, a strange smell, a chemical odor stronger than usual, began to fill the air. Again, it wasn't enough for anyone to panic. It was only later, after the explosion, that it was revealed that dangerous levels of gas had begun to leak into the air. But by then, it was too late. At that point, workers had already ignored the alarm that rang, which was designed to alert them to a hazardous buildup of gas. This failure to act was not due to a lack of information. The signs were there. The alarm itself, though, is the most telling part of the story. When the alarm first sounded, there was an immediate sense of urgency. It wasn't the usual, standard warning tone. It was more insistent, a higher-pitched sound that could be heard across the entire plant. Workers, initially startled, looked around. The safety protocols were clear. The moment the alarm went off, everyone had to stop working and evacuate. But instead of following the procedure, a series of decisions led to the most tragic of outcomes. Why did they hesitate? Some later speculated that the workers had grown too comfortable in the factory. They had worked there for years, and accidents, while serious, were never as bad as the rumors suggested. Perhaps the individuals in charge thought the alarm could be a false alarm, something that was triggered by an equipment malfunction. It wasn't long before the decision was made to keep working, to continue as if nothing had happened. This hesitation would prove to be their undoing. The alarm continued to blare, and yet the team ignored it. What could have been done at that moment to prevent the explosion? If only they had stopped everything immediately, followed the evacuation procedures. Or had someone step in to make the tough call? The outcome might have been different, but inaction, coupled with overconfidence, allowed the gas to build up to dangerous levels, and soon, the smallest spark would set off the most catastrophic industrial explosion ever recorded. It's easy to say, in hindsight, that the alarm should never have been ignored, but in the chaotic environment of an industrial plant, under pressure, what led to the critical decision to dismiss the warning? Could it have been prevented? In this part of the story, we dive into the psychology behind the decision to ignore the alarm and the dangerous consequences that followed. The first instinct when an alarm goes off is usually to take immediate action, but this time something was different. The workers, especially the supervisors, had heard alarms before. They were part of the routine, a false alarm, a glitch, a simple malfunction. It's possible that, after hearing the alarm, some thought, it's just another test. Maybe it was the familiarity of the factory's normal hums and buzzes that caused people to underestimate the danger. After all, accidents had happened before, but they were usually manageable, and nothing had escalated to this level in recent history. Some workers had even voiced concerns about the pressure levels earlier in the day, but nothing had been done. The plant was busy, the pressure was mounting to meet quotas, and people were eager to finish their shifts. Perhaps it was a case of complacency. The idea that nothing serious could happen, it's always fine. This mindset of ignoring the obvious dangers, of believing that routine was more important than precaution, is one of the primary reasons the alarm was not taken seriously. As the alarm continued to ring, some workers decided to continue with their tasks, choosing to ignore the possible risks in front of them. Was this a moment of sheer negligence or simply a matter of priorities misaligned? There was no immediate danger perceived by the decision-makers. No physical sign of immediate harm, just a loud noise. But by failing to act, by allowing that 3-minute window to slip by, they sealed their fate. Another factor that likely played a role in the hesitation was the lack of visible consequences for previous safety lapses. The company had experienced smaller issues before, minor leaks, equipment failures, but nothing catastrophic. Over time, people grow comfortable in their environment, and those warnings begin to feel less urgent. That false sense of security made the situation more dangerous. Could someone have stopped the workers from continuing their tasks? Should there have been a stronger emphasis on safety protocols? Perhaps if higher authorities had enforced stricter procedures, the outcome might have been different. But it wasn't, until the explosion happened, that the gravity of those 3 minutes became evident. It wasn't just a case of ignoring the alarm. It was a series of small, cumulative decisions to downplay the potential danger. The momentary lapse in judgment proved to be fatal, leaving many to question whether they had truly learned from past mistakes or had simply been too confident in their own routines. The moment the explosion occurred was nothing short of catastrophic. The factory, which had been a hive of activity just moments before, was now engulfed in flames, debris, and chaos. The sound of the blast echoed for miles, a deafening roar that would forever change the landscape of the industrial area. The alarm that had been ignored for 3 minutes now seemed like a cruel reminder of what could have been prevented. The explosion didn't happen in a split second. It was the result of a series of failures that culminated in a massive release of energy. The buildup of toxic gas, combined with the ignition from a spark, created a perfect storm. The facility was filled with highly flammable chemicals, and the gas had seeped into the air, unnoticed by the workers who had been too focused on their tasks. In that moment of ignorance, the worst-case scenario unfolded. As the blast tore through the plant, walls crumbled, windows shattered, and the machinery that once hummed with productivity was now reduced to twisted metal and rubble. Fires erupted almost immediately, fueled by the chemicals and gases that had built up in the air. It was chaos. Thick black smoke billowed into the sky, blocking the sun, and the air was thick with dust and fumes. The workers who had been within the blast radius were either caught in the explosion or trapped under the debris. The shockwave sent buildings crumbling, and the ground shook as if it were an earthquake. The first responders who rushed to the scene were met with scenes of devastation, fires burning out of control, people screaming for help, and the horror of witnessing the aftermath of what could have been avoided. But the question remained, how could this have happened? How could something like this have spiraled out of control so quickly? At this moment, the factory was no longer just a place of production. It had turned into a nightmare. There was no time to think about the cause at that moment. only the immediate task at hand, saving as many lives as possible, putting out the fires, and trying to control the damage. The workers who had ignored the alarm were now part of the tragedy, some fighting for their lives, others too injured to escape the flames. The magnitude of the explosion was unlike anything the industry had ever seen. The blast created a crater in the ground, and the surrounding buildings were either completely destroyed or severely damaged. The fire raged for hours, and the rescue operations were hindered by the structural instability of the remaining buildings. Every step taken by the responders brought them closer to the realization that this was no ordinary accident. It was a disaster that could have been prevented. The scale of destruction caused by the explosion was far beyond anything that could have been anticipated. What had once been a thriving industrial plant, employing hundreds of workers and producing critical materials, was now a smoldering ruin. The explosion not only decimated the building, but left a long-lasting impact on the entire community. In the immediate aftermath, the toll was catastrophic. It was later reported that the blast had killed dozens of workers instantly, while many more suffered life-threatening injuries. Some of the victims were trapped under the rubble, unable to escape the inferno. The first responders who arrived at the scene were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the disaster. There was no way to prepare for the sight that greeted them: the blackened ruins, the charred remains of equipment, and the bodies of those who had been too close to the epicenter of the explosion. The explosion also had a profound effect on the surrounding area. The shockwave shattered windows miles away from the factory, and the intense heat from the fire damaged nearby structures. Buildings within a 1-mile radius of the plant suffered varying degrees of damage. Some were completely destroyed, while others had their walls and roofs blown off. The surrounding streets were littered with debris, making it nearly impossible for rescuers to navigate the area. In the days that followed, the full extent of the damage began to emerge. The chemical contamination from the explosion had spread across the area, posing a serious environmental hazard. Dangerous chemicals had leaked into the soil and water, and the fire's toxic fumes hung in the air, making it hazardous for anyone to approach without proper protective gear. The community, which had once relied on the plant for jobs and resources, was now left grappling with the long-term consequences of the disaster. The explosion also had far-reaching economic consequences. The plant had been a cornerstone of the local economy, providing jobs to thousands of people. But now, not only were many employees dead or injured, but the plant itself was beyond repair. Local businesses that relied on the plant's production were forced to shut down, and the town was left in a state of economic devastation. Insurance claims flooded in, but the damage was so widespread that it would take years for the town to recover fully. This explosion wasn't just an industrial accident, it was a wake-up call for the industry as a whole. It raised questions about the safety protocols in place at plants like these, and sparked widespread calls for regulatory changes to prevent such a disaster from happening again. But for the families of the victims, no amount of regulation could bring back what was lost. While the explosion took the lives of many, some survived, though not without enduring unimaginable physical and emotional scars. The survivors' stories are among the most heartbreaking aspects of this disaster. Their lives would never be the same after the explosion, as they faced not only the pain of their injuries but also the haunting memory of the event that changed everything. For many of the survivors, the immediate aftermath of the explosion was a blur. The sheer force of the blast threw them to the ground, leaving them disoriented and struggling to understand what had just happened. The air was thick with smoke, and the sounds of the explosion echoed in their ears. Some were trapped under the debris, their bodies pinned beneath the rubble. Others had been thrown clear of the blast zone but were badly burned or injured from the flying debris. One survivor, a worker who had been near the center of the explosion, later recalled the sheer terror of that moment. "I heard the alarm, but I didn't move in time," he said. "I thought it was just another drill, and then the ground shook. Everything just exploded. The noise, the heat, I couldn't even breathe. I thought I was going to die." He was later found by rescue workers, barely conscious and suffering from third-degree burns over much of his body. He spent months in the hospital, recovering from the burns and trauma, but the psychological scars would take much longer to heal. Another survivor, a plant supervisor, was among the first to receive medical attention. She had been in the process of trying to get workers evacuated when the explosion hit. The blast threw her across the room, knocking her unconscious for several minutes. When she regained consciousness, she found herself buried under rubble, struggling to breathe. With the help of a colleague, she managed to crawl out of the debris, severely injured but alive. She spent weeks in the hospital and later testified during the investigation, recounting the moment of the explosion and the choices that led to the failure to evacuate in time. For many survivors, the physical injuries were just the beginning. The trauma of the explosion and the loss of co-workers weighed heavily on them. Many survivors experienced survivor's guilt, struggling to come to terms with the fact that they had lived while others perished. Post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD) was common among the workers who had survived, and many faced years of counseling and therapy to cope with the mental and emotional toll of the disaster. One of the most difficult aspects of being a survivor was returning to the site of the disaster. For many, the factory was not just a workplace, it had been a place of community. They had worked alongside their friends and family, and now that it had been destroyed, the psychological impact was profound. Returning to the site of the explosion meant confronting not just the physical destruction, but also the emotional devastation that lingered in the air. The stories of the survivors serve as a stark reminder of the human cost of industrial disasters. While the physical scars may fade over time, the emotional wounds last much longer. The trauma of that day would stay with them forever, shaping their lives in ways they never could have imagined. In the wake of the explosion, the community and the world demanded answers. How could this catastrophic event have occurred? Was it just a matter of human error, or was there a deeper, systemic failure at play? The investigation into the disaster would reveal shocking findings that no one had anticipated, exposing the flaws in the plant's safety protocols, equipment, and decision-making processes. The first step in the investigation was to determine the cause of the explosion. The authorities immediately set to work examining the debris, the chemical components involved, and the plant's machinery. The initial theory was that a gas leak had triggered the blast, and this hypothesis seemed plausible given the evidence of chemical contamination and the buildup of toxic gases in the air. But as investigators dug deeper, they discovered that the situation was far more complex. It became apparent that the gas leak was just one part of the equation. While the leak itself was undoubtedly dangerous, it was the failure to respond to the alarm that had turned a manageable situation into a full-scale disaster. The plant's workers, despite receiving a warning, had failed to take appropriate action, a failure that, it turns out, was rooted in deeper issues within the company's safety culture. Upon reviewing the safety protocols, it was revealed that the alarm system had been in place for years, but had been routinely ignored or dismissed during minor incidents. Workers had grown complacent with the alarms, and the protocols themselves were outdated, failing to account for the potential risks of modern chemical production. The lack of urgency in responding to alarms had become ingrained in the culture, and this disaster was the result of a slow accumulation of poor safety practices. Further investigation revealed another critical oversight: the plant's equipment. The machinery used to monitor gas levels and detect leaks had been poorly maintained, and in some cases, malfunctioned during crucial moments. The failure to perform regular inspections, combined with a lack of investment in updating aging equipment, left the plant vulnerable to catastrophe. The most shocking revelation came when it was discovered that the decision to ignore the alarm had not been the result of one person's oversight. Instead, it was a collective failure, stemming from a lack of accountability at all levels of the company. Supervisors had failed to enforce safety measures, and workers had failed to report dangerous conditions, trusting that things would be fine. This attitude, fostered by years of prioritizing production over safety, ultimately led to the disaster. The investigation concluded with a damning report that placed the blame squarely on both human error and inadequate safety protocols. While no single individual was solely responsible for the explosion, the company as a whole was found to be at fault for allowing a culture of neglect to persist. The report recommended sweeping changes to safety standards, equipment upgrades, and a complete overhaul of the plant's operational practices. The findings of the investigation sent shockwaves through the industrial world. It wasn't just a wake-up call for the company in question, it was a wake-up call for the entire industry. The explosion exposed the dangers of cutting corners, ignoring warnings, and failing to update safety measures in a rapidly evolving industrial landscape. After the investigation concluded, the full extent of the plant's negligence became clear. The findings were damning, but what came next was perhaps even more significant: the ripple effect it had on the wider industrial community. In the wake of the explosion, Companies, regulatory bodies, and governments scrambled to address the glaring issues that had been exposed. The disaster didn't just change the company, it set off a wave of reforms and policy changes across the industry. The first step was accountability. Several individuals within the company were held responsible for their actions, or lack thereof. While no one person was charged with direct culpability for the explosion, a number of managers and supervisors were either suspended, reprimanded, or fired. The company faced massive fines, and some of its senior executives were forced to step down. The corporate culture that had led to the explosion was now under intense scrutiny, and the leadership had to take responsibility for failing to maintain proper safety measures and enforce basic protocols. But accountability wasn't enough to prevent similar disasters in the future. The company's failure to prioritize safety had left a permanent stain on its reputation, and it faced intense public backlash. Communities around the plant demanded answers, and citizens began organizing to ensure that no such tragedy would occur again. The media took up the cause, and public pressure mounted for stricter regulations on industrial safety. In response, both national and international regulatory bodies began revisiting their safety standards. New legislation was enacted to mandate regular safety audits, stricter maintenance of equipment, and more robust employee training on emergency procedures. The explosion had shown that simply having safety protocols in place wasn't enough. They needed to be enforced, updated, and followed meticulously. The tragedy also sparked a broader conversation about corporate responsibility and the need for more oversight in higher-risk industries. Governments around the world started to introduce tougher regulations to protect workers and communities from the dangers of industrial accidents. Companies were required to invest more in safety infrastructure, and transparency became a key aspect of industrial operations. For the first time, the industrial sector was being held accountable, not just for the success of its products, but for the well-being of its employees and the environment. The aftermath also brought to light the need for better communication and coordination between plant management and workers. In many cases, employees had felt disconnected from management, which led to a lack of trust in the safety systems that were supposed to protect them. The explosion highlighted how important it was for everyone, from the CEO to the entry-level worker, to be fully invested in maintaining safety. It wasn't just a matter of checking boxes on a safety report. It was about fostering a culture where everyone was responsible for ensuring that accidents were prevented at every step. For many, the explosion became a turning point, a reminder of how quickly things could go wrong when complacency takes over, and while nothing could bring back the lives lost or undo the destruction, it set the stage for the industrial world to rethink how it approached safety, accountability, and the lives of those who worked within it. The explosion and its aftermath didn't just affect the company involved, it sent shockwaves through the entire industrial sector. The catastrophic event forced companies and governments worldwide to rethink their safety standards, causing a shift in the way the industry approached risk management, worker protection, and operational procedures. What began as a tragedy for one company ultimately led to a global reassessment of industrial safety. Following the explosion, industrial safety became a primary focus of both national and international regulatory bodies. In response to the disaster, several countries revised their workplace safety laws, implementing more stringent regulations to protect workers in higher-risk environments. These regulations included stricter guidelines on equipment maintenance, better safety training for workers, and more frequent and detailed safety audits for factories and plants. In some places, inspections became mandatory, and failure to comply with safety protocols could lead to heavy fines or even the shutdown of operations. Moreover, the explosion had a profound effect on how companies communicated with their workers about safety. It became clear that factory workers, who were often the first to witness warning signs, needed to be empowered to take action when they noticed potential risks. As a result, there was a greater emphasis on creating open channels of communication between employees and management. Many companies introduced anonymous reporting systems where workers could voice concerns about safety without fear of retaliation. Safety training also became more comprehensive, with an increased focus on teaching workers how to identify hazards and respond appropriately to alarms or emergencies. The disaster also led to a rise in the development of new safety technologies. In an effort to prevent similar incidents, Engineers and safety experts worked tirelessly to develop more reliable alarm systems, better gas detection equipment, and automatic shutdown systems for higher-risk machinery. These technological advancements helped improve the safety of industrial environments and reduce the likelihood of similar accidents. But, perhaps more importantly, the explosion prompted a cultural shift within the industry. It encouraged a greater focus on prevention rather than just compliance with safety standards. Companies began to realize that true safety wasn't just about meeting regulations, it was about creating a culture where safety was prioritized at every level of operation. In addition to changes in safety protocols, the explosion had a lasting economic impact on the industry. The affected company faced immense financial strain as a result of the explosion. In addition to paying for repairs and rebuilding, it had to deal with legal settlements, fines, and compensation for the victims. The explosion also led to higher insurance premiums for companies in higher-risk industries, as insurers recognized the need to account for the potential for such catastrophic events. As a result, many companies took a more cautious approach, reducing their risk exposure by investing in safer equipment and improving their internal safety measures. The global impact of the explosion also led to more public awareness of industrial safety issues. People began to realize that industrial accidents weren't just the result of isolated errors, they were often the consequence of systemic failures within the industry. The media played a key role in spreading this awareness, reporting extensively on the incident and its aftermath. The disaster became a symbol of the need for greater corporate accountability and a reminder that the lives of workers should never be compromised for the sake of profits. As we look back on this industrial disaster, it's clear that it wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a turning point for the entire industry. The tragedy exposed the deadly consequences of negligence, complacency, and a failure to prioritize safety. The blast that rocked the factory was more than just an accident, it was a stark reminder of the fragile nature of human lives when industrial processes are handled without the utmost care and responsibility. This explosion, which could have been prevented with a few crucial decisions, serves as a permanent mark on the collective memory of industrial workers and companies. The devastating loss of life, the destruction of property, and the long-term psychological and emotional trauma endured by the survivors and the families of the victims cannot be erased. But as much as this tragedy left a scar, it also became a catalyst for change. The reforms that followed, stricter safety regulations, improved worker training, better technology, were born from the mistakes made that day. Companies began to realize that safety could no longer be treated as an afterthought, a checkbox on a compliance list. Safety had to be embedded into the very culture of the workplace, from the highest executives to the newest workers. But even with these changes, the question remains, how many more lives need to be lost before we truly learn the value of preventing these disasters before they occur? For the victims and their families, this explosion will never just be a historical event. It is a personal tragedy, one that haunts their memories and their futures. The survivors live with the constant reminder of the blast, the scars, both physical and emotional, that they will carry for the rest of their lives. This is why understanding the significance of this tragedy is so important. We must never forget the lessons learned, the lives lost, and the communities torn apart. By remembering and reflecting on such events, we can ensure that we do everything possible to prevent future disasters. The risk is always present, but it is up to each of us, whether we're factory workers, executives, or regulators, to uphold the standards of safety that can protect lives and keep such tragedies from repeating. As you reflect on this story, I want to ask, what do you think are the most important lessons we should learn from this explosion? How can we ensure that future generations of workers remain safe? Comment your thoughts below, and if you found this video insightful, hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more important stories like this. Thank you for watching. Remember, the past holds crucial lessons for the future. Don't let this tragedy be forgotten, and share your thoughts with us. The conversation doesn't end here.